Welcome to section 14.1 Rational Expressions. Today we're going to cover multiplying, and the next part of the same section is going to be dividing. But right now we're going to just cover mainly with multiplying. So what we mean by rational expression is a rational is a fraction, an integer over another integer. So this is what a rational expression is going to look like. Basically, an expression over another expression. But we're multiplying with fractions, so we also must remember on the properties on working with fractions. Now, for this chapter, when we're dealing with rational expression, you need to be familiar, and I emphasize very familiar, with all the factoring techniques that was covered in chapter 13. Meaning, you need to be familiar when to know when and where to factor by GCF and grouping, the technique for factoring trinomials, the factoring rule for perfect squares, and the factoring rule for difference of squares. So if you're not familiar with these four techniques, the four rules, then I would highly recommend to review over chapter 13. Again, you need to be very familiar and need to be able to know when and where to factor based on what the problem you have when you're doing GCF and grouping, or trinomial, or the factoring rule for perfect square, or the factoring rule for difference of square. Once you're familiar with that, then this section will be fairly okay, because the main part of this section is the factoring part. Once you finish factoring, then it's going to be smooth sailing after this. Now, when we're working with this example, in our first fraction, we have 5x squared minus 10x over x squared minus x minus 12 times the second fraction, x squared minus 16 over x squared minus 5x plus 6. So we're multiplying with fraction, but before we can actually multiply, the first thing you want to do is, one, make sure it's multiplying. Second is we're going to factor each part. So we have the top, the bottom of the first fraction, the top and the bottom of the second fraction. So we have 4 parts, meaning we're going to factor 4 times. So let's take a look at the numerator of the first fraction. 5x squared minus 10x. So it's 2 terms. So it's either GCF and grouping or perfect difference of square, because those are 2 terms. So none of them is a perfect square, so the only thing we can do is GCF and grouping. So I'm going to factor out this quickly. So what's in common between 5x squared minus 10x is the 5 and the x. So I'm going to factor out the 5x, and inside the parentheses will be x minus 2. So my GCF is 5x. I'm not going to do all the work as what we did in chapter 13. That is expected for you to know how to do it. I recommend that you use your space in your notes to write out the work so you can see the process. But here, I'm not going to do the work for time's sake. And then on the bottom, x squared minus x minus 12, 3 terms. So I'm going to use the method for factoring trinomials. When you factor, you should have x minus 4 times x plus 3. Alright, now we're going to factor the second fraction. So in the numerator, it's x squared minus 16. Those two are perfect squares, so I'm using the rule for difference of square. So in my numerator, it's going to be x minus 4 times x plus 4. And then on the bottom, x squared minus 5x plus 6 is going to be a trinomial, so I'm going to do the work for factoring trinomial. I'm not going to write it out, I'm just basically doing it in my head. But I would recommend that you write it out in your notes to understand the process. So when you factor, you should have x minus 2 over x minus 3. Alright. Now, once I finish, and again, as long as you remember that you're multiplying between these two fractions, what we're going to do is we're going to divide, I repeat, divide common factors, meaning we're going to divide one factor from the numerator and the denominator if there's repeating. So since these two are multiplying, that means basically they're going to be one big fraction combined. So if I do that, then I could write it like this: 5x times x minus 2 times x minus 4 times x plus 4 over x minus 4 x plus 3 x minus 2 and then x minus 3. Alright, so as I said before, we're going to divide common factors. So when I'm crossing them out, I'm actually dividing them into 1. So let's take a look. I notice I have an x minus 2 in the numerator and denominator. So when you divide them, it will become 1. Let's check if we have any other common factors. I notice I have x minus 4 in the numerator and in the denominator, so I'm going to divide and it will become 1. So if it becomes 1, then basically you're just going to multiply what you have in the numerator and the denominator, and it's going to come out the same thing. So for example, I have no more common factors to divide, so these two became 1. So 5x times 1 times 1 times 5x, x plus 4, sorry, will be simply 5x times x plus 4. And in my denominator, 1 times x plus 3 times 1 times x minus 3 will simply be x plus 3 and x minus 3. So basically, I just rewrote the terms that I did not divide, that I did not cross out. So again, I divide the common factors and it became 1. So x minus 2 divided by x minus 2 became 1. X minus 4 divided by x minus 4 became 1. Anything that I did not cross out will end up in my final answer. So, my final answer is 5x times x plus 4 over x plus 3 times x minus 3. So this is our final answer after you simplify this rational expression when it's multiplying with each other. So again, make sure you're familiar with all the rules and techniques for factoring, because we basically factor 4 times. Now the only thing new is we divide common factors and then just basically write out the ones that we did not cross out, meaning we did not divide. And then once you finish simplifying, this is your final answer.